Hello everyone, my name is Sam Harkus. I'm an audiologist from Australian Hearing. I work in Sydney. I'm very pleased to be here on Awabakal country, to have been welcomed to Awabakal country, and Kelvin, I'm looking forward to being on Warramai land this afternoon. So I'm going to talk about a hearing screening trial that we're involved in Tennant Creek in the Northern Territory, and I'd like to acknowledge our partners in this trial, who are the NT Department of Corrections, the National Disability Insurance Agency, and Anningi Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Service in Tennant Creek. And in particular, I'd like to acknowledge Ross Cole, Senior Aboriginal Health Worker, who's done a lot of work towards this and did think about coming down to Omoz, but his dad is not well and I think he wants to stay in the Territory and be close by. Right, now how do I work this? Okay. So we all know that Aboriginal people are overrepresented in our prisons. The rate of imprisonment for Aboriginal adults is 15 times what it is for non-Indigenous Australians. And we also know from quite a few pieces of research that hearing loss is overrepresented in Aboriginal inmates. So in all studies, Aboriginal prisoners have higher rates of hearing loss than their non-Indigenous peers. Now, I wanted to talk particularly, or make reference particularly to Damien Howard and Troy Vanderpoel's survey of, in 2011 of Aboriginal inmates in Darwin and Alice Springs prisons, because that's particularly relevant to what we're doing in Tennant Creek in the NT. And they found that 94% of 134 Aboriginal inmates had significant hearing loss. This has received quite a bit of attention in the media, rightly so, over the last few years. I just wanted to make the point that after talking to Damien, significant hearing loss, what he described as significant hearing loss in his study, was anything other than normal. So that's useful to keep in mind as we talk about the results of, that are coming out of our trial. But he also found that hearing loss is, not surprisingly, normalised and underreported by inmates in Darwin and Alice Springs prisons. We know that the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody in 1991, and then also the Senate inquiry into hearing health in Australia a few years ago, commented on the relationship between ear disease in childhood, hearing loss and poor school performance, and their connection to getting caught up in the criminal justice system. And the Senate inquiry made a recommendation that hearing assessments should be made available for Aboriginal people in prison who have never been tested before, and that prisons should encourage Aboriginal people to participate in this. From what we can work out, we don't think any prisons have implemented this, and identification of prisoners with hearing loss relies on self-report. So that's either waiting for an inmate to volunteer the information that they have a hearing loss, or asking whether someone has a hearing loss. And we suspect that because we know that hearing loss is normal for so many Aboriginal people, that it's maybe not a good way of identifying people with hearing loss. Okay, so the two trial outcomes are to evaluate whether self-report is a reliable indicator of significant hearing loss in prisoners, in Aboriginal prisoners, but also to have a look at this new South African hearing screening smartphone app called HearScreen, which actually isn't commercially available here yet, but we got some advanced copies to test it out to see if it might work well in this context. So a couple of things just to note first. We selected a screening threshold, a hearing screening pass-fail threshold of 35 decibels, which is more conservative than the usual pass-fail threshold that we see. And we chose that because we thought we wanted to identify inmates who are finding that their hearing loss is a problem and who might be more at the point of being motivated to seek treatment. And we also thought that choosing a lower pass-fail threshold was likely to generate significantly higher numbers of referrals, which was quite likely to overwhelm a system that's not yet mature enough to cope with that number of referrals. So we thought we'd focus our resources on the people who we thought might need them most. Okay, and Hear Screen, this is just a slide about that. So it's a smartphone app. It sits on a Samsung device at this point. It was developed in South Africa with the aim of getting hearing screening services to more underserved populations, of course with the idea of connecting them to further services. It's simple, it's fast, and it's designed for use by people who have never been trained in hearing screening. It has great sensitivity and specificity when you compare it to standard screening audiometry, and there's no significant difference in referral rates when you compare one against the other. Okay, the procedure. So this is Ross, and Ross goes to the work camp every 2 to 4 weeks. There's no health service on site. If there was, that would probably change what we had done. The hearing screening is voluntary, so the prison camp are really supportive of this, and they promote the visits and they organise inmates to attend. Ross does otoscopy and he asks a question about hearing, and then he does the screening. And then, of course, anyone who doesn't pass, he connects them with services after that. So that might be with us, or it might be to NT Hearing, or it might be back to Ananingi for treatment. So to date, we began collecting data, or Ross did, in December last year, and he's screened 60 inmates so far and all gave consent. So far, 47% of inmates have bilaterally normal eardrums. He asks all inmates, do you have hearing trouble? Which is very similar to what Damien and Troy asked in their 2011 survey. So far, 22% of inmates have failed hearing screening at the 35 dB threshold. And interestingly, of the 13 inmates who have failed, 8 reported that they don't have hearing trouble. When you look at sensitivity, so sensitivity of, or the ability of self-report to correctly identify those inmates with significant hearing loss, it's not great at 38%. And specificity, which is the ability of self-report to correctly identify inmates with normal or near normal hearing, it's 80%, which is better but not as good as you would like to see. So far, self-report is proving better at picking up people who have normal hearing than people with hearing trouble, but it's not doing it very well for either group of people. So, of course, this suggests that if we rely on self-report as a way of picking up inmates with hearing problems, it's likely to lead to a combination of either inappropriate referrals or missed referrals, which is the greater risk. How do we find Hear Screen? It is fast. It takes about 1 minute to screen an adult who passes, and maybe 2 or 3 minutes to screen an adult where you have to retest. It is really easy. It doesn't even come with instructions. The app itself guides you in what to do, so anyone can pick it up and use it. We know it's validated, but the interesting thing was that when we did diagnostic hearing assessment for some of the people who didn't pass, it aligns really well with the diagnostic audiogram. And we know that the cost at the moment for us to buy one from South Africa is about $1,000, which is much lower than a standard screening audiometer, and of course you don't have the training costs associated. So I think it's really, worth looking at. The disadvantage, which is quite a big one, is that prisons don't like smartphones. So we have to get over that. The Barclay Work Camp are really cool about it. They're low security, and we had to show it to them, and they said, yes, that's okay. There is a slight issue there. But we have been talking to NT Corrections, have been really interested in this work, and we have been talking to them about what to do, with next in light of this preliminary data. And we think that we have some hurdles to jump, but we think that we might be introducing this, or they might be introducing this at Don Dale, which would be really amazing. Anyway, that's a watch this space. Okay, so there's an obvious discussion point here, and that's the fact that we're getting a very different percentage than Damien Howard and Troy Vanderpoel's survey. So we're finding that 22% of inmates haven't passed, but Damien and Troy found 93%. So how can we explain this? And Damien and I have talked about this. So we think that probably the 10 dB difference in screening threshold accounts for a large proportion. So if you go back and have a look at the data from the 2011 study and you apply roughly a 35 dB cut-off, you would find that 38% of the Darwin and Alice Springs inmates would fail, not 93%. So that's good. That means that there's some consistency and it's getting closer to our rate of 22%. The other thing we thought about was whether the voluntary nature of participant selection, so the fact that we're asking people whether they'd like to participate, whether that biases the study group in some way. So is someone with a hearing loss less likely to say, oh yes, I'd like my hearing tested? But when we went back and had a look at the Alice Springs and Darwin study, we found that the Darwin cohort were voluntary, the Alice Springs cohort were mandatory. So that gave us a group of people that we could compare against each other, and there's very little difference in the percentage of prisoners who failed between those two groups. So we think that it may be a factor, but it doesn't seem to be a major factor at this point. So, Ross and I had a conversation about how it was going and what were his reflections on the project. He's a very experienced health worker and a very thoughtful and insightful man. And he reflected that when he was growing up, he had ear disease himself. And he remembers that the main thing that happened for him was that he was seated at the front of the class. He feels that he and the boys like him were never really connected with the services that they needed to help them hear well. He left school early and he started working, which was the influence of his dad. So his dad he said, yes, you can leave, but you really have to get a job if you do. And he's really aware of other boys or his peers who also left school early but got caught up in other stuff. So when he reflects on whether the screening is worthwhile, he says, yes, it's worthwhile. It's that opportunity to go that step further. They've probably been picked up before at school and never got to the stage where they can get proper help. It makes a big difference. They're not going to be applying for jobs if they have a hearing problem. So I think it's very much that idea that people who were missed in the past and didn't end up getting connected with the services that they needed then, that this presents another opportunity to do that. Okay, so to summarise, 22% of our prisoners haven't passed at 35 dB. Self-report is relied upon and our data suggests that it's not reliable. Based on this, we'd recommend hearing screening instead of self-report, and hear screen is an option if we can actually get it into prisons. And thank you very much for listening.